Good morning, everyone. Thank you to be here with us and to share your time and experience with us. Thank you to Roy, Elaine. Henry is online and you cannot see him now. And Michael is online as well for this symposium. Let me first introduce our speakers. You already have seen this in the website, but anyway, it's Henry Mintzberg. Here is the John Clegon Professor of Management Studies at McGill University. Roy Suddaby, that is on my right, Franz Mintzberg, Professor, and Peter Gustafsson, School of Business in University of Victoria, and Elaine, Professor of Management and Linder College of Business, University of Cincinnati. And you have the pre-recorded sessions of Jeffrey Sachs in the website and Phan as well. Together with Roy and Michael, we have put together this symposium on revisiting the purpose of both businesses and business school. And I would like to make just a short introduction to answer two questions, and why purpose revisit, why this symposium is important, and then how we create a reflective and motivational space. And then we will give the floor to the speakers. And the idea is space. First is this issue of the power of business. If you see Apple is the eighth potence in the world, when you compare market cap with GDP. So countries like Italy, Brazil are behind Apple. That's the power of business here, and it's just a fact of space. And the other fact here is regarding the economic value and the human value of businesses, because when you compare the companies in the industrial era to the digital era or the platform revolution, you can see the two sides, the market cap and the employees. Market cap is almost the same, but you can see the effect, the impact on the employee side. And then when you see this, for example, this have done for Edelman in 2020, 83% of the people have fear of losing their jobs. So this is the dimension of a space of why revisiting the purpose of business is important here. When we are going to time, this is nothing new, because since 2000 until now, you can see different milestones regarding to the purpose of businesses. For example, in 2000, the UN 8 Millennial Goals. And then in 2006, maybe you are not aware of that, but it was the first UN Academy of Management Conference, Together for a Better World, like the title of this year, Academy of Management Conference. And this was the origin of the principle for responsible management education at that time. I remember Jim Walsh was the president of the academy, and he do this alliance with the United Nations for moving forward these principles. And then in 2015, you have these UN 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Jeffrey Sachs was one of the mastermind behind that. And then in 2019, there was a US Business Roundtable that moved from shareholder to stakeholder value. And then the World Economic Forum last year, the Great Reset Initiative. I will just focus on this point. This is the UN Business Roundtable, when in this statement, they moved from Milton Friedman shareholder value to the new stakeholder value. That's why if we go through time, this is a proper time to revisit this point. And then regarding us, is our academic vocation. This is a phrase of, Keynes about the idea of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slave of some defunct economists. So we can cite here Milton Friedman with the idea of the purpose of business of maximizing share value, but you see that the practical men, the US Business Roundtable, changed the statement from shareholder to stakeholder. We'll see how this happens in practice, but that's important. Why this is important? Because of our academic call or academic vocation. That's why we're putting together this symposium on this topic. And then how we will create this reflecting environment. So we'll have each question. Michael will ask the first question, and then the panelists, first Roy, Elaine, and last Henry, will answer the question. And then we allow time for QA from those who are present this is co-creation because here we have Sherry use the microphone to go through the room. Thank you, Sherry, for doing this work for us. And then Michael will manage the QA from the online people in the room. So we have 3 questions. The first one, what might be the foundational values of a post-pandemic market system? The second one is the purpose of business in a post-pandemic scenario. And the third one, what will be a post-pandemic business school look like? So Michael, I give the floor to you just to coordinate the first question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. And thank you, Hector, for introducing this and continuing this important conversation that many in the room here have participated in. And yes, we want to go back to the foundational values question. Do we need new foundational values, or how do we revisit the existing ones? What went wrong, if anything, with the values that we base our current system on? So that's the question. Like, what do you see on the panel and everybody else? What do you see as the foundational values that are needed for a post-pandemic world? Back over to the room.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay, so I want to first correct an error in the program. It was actually a very terrifying typo. It said that I was the former editor of SMJ, and so I'm not. I was an associate editor at the Academy of Management Journal, and I worked there during Jerry George's term, and he's been very involved in this initiative. And so we decided that our goal would be to study grand challenges facing businesses, facing communities, facing nations, things like climate change, poverty, inequality. And so I come here from the perspective of being a micro qualitative researcher rather than a strategic researcher. So I just wanted to lower the expectations a little bit. As far as foundational values in a post-pandemic market system, I think what we saw during COVID was how important it is to really value people's well-being. So I would say valuing well-being and creating or enabling fulfilling meaningful lives is a value that I think it has raised in importance among both employees and employers since the pandemic. And so rather than exploit employees and treat them as though they are commodities or unidimensional or instruments, look at them more as human beings. And so that would be one value. I think also there's been an increasing awareness of the importance of social justice as a value and a concern for inequalities. And not just economic inequalities, but I think access inequalities, access to healthcare, access to goods and services. We saw supply chain disruptions, but we also saw people who were unable to get vaccines. And so we also saw drug companies inflating prices, that sort of thing, shutting out access to people with low incomes. And so I think the importance of social justice and an awareness and concern for inequalities that exist is something that is important post-pandemic. And I think many of us looked at those photos, the satellite photos of the Earth that they took during the shutdown. I thought those were really, really stark in that you could see the reduction. I mean, from month to month, the reduction of pollution because of the shutdown of manufacturing and polluting transportation. And so another value, I think, is an appreciation for climate change. And I think that's growing in importance. Rather than shirking responsibility for addressing pollution and climate change, I think it's raised in terms of a value. So I think there's been a movement away from self-interest and a movement more toward common good. And if you watched one of the videos, I believe it was Jeff's video, he talked a lot about common good, and that's an important value. So I think there's also recognition that there's a fundamental interdependence between business and society, and that has escalated in importance. And then finally, I'm just going to touch on the values. So Jerry and I did an editorial in AMJ in 2014 on purposeful business, organizations with purpose. And we talked with a couple of people in Europe who were aligned with the blueprint for better business trust. And we also interviewed Cardinal Vincent Nichols, who was actually a cardinal in the Catholic Church. He was for the Diocese of Westminster. And we came up with some values that we think would help organizations pursue purpose. The first one being dignity. And again, I come at this from a micro qualitative perspective. I'm concerned with people rather than necessarily systems. I think Roy is probably the good complement here. but viewing each person as a person rather than a thing. I think that's a value. Dignity, treating people with dignity. Solidarity, recognizing that we're all in this together, including the underprivileged, including the underserved, including the disenfranchised. We are all in this together. The third value, and there are 6 of them, the third one was plurality, valuing diversity rather than excluding people who think differently from us. The fourth one was subsidiarity, which is just giving employees autonomy and the ability to make decisions so that they can actually be purpose-driven, rather than being constrained. And then I've already mentioned reciprocity, seeing the interdependence that exists between businesses and the communities that they serve. And then finally, sustainability, being good stewards of the resources and the people and the values, and embedding this into your purpose as an organization and your mission. So these are really values of society as much as they are values of organizations, but I think they're important things to think about post-pandemic.
Thank you, Roy.
So I guess I am a good compliment to Elaine. I'm going to answer this question through the perspective of a qualitative macro org theory researcher. And I qualify this to say I'm not making any predictions about the values, but rather to say what the aspirational shift in values that I would like to see out there. And I'll make 2 comments or two shifts in values that I think are important post-pandemic. One of the clear indications as an organizational theorist that I saw as a result, and we're still seeing today as we come out of the pandemic, is that we take for granted much of the organization of the world. We assume that supply chains work flawlessly, even though they occur somewhat invisibly in our life. We assume that airlines will look after our bags, even though we don't actually get to observe that. And one of the things that we realize is that this sort of cognitive legitimacy that we have of the organizational world is starting to fray. And we realize that perhaps we shouldn't take for granted that degree of organization out there. So one hope that I have is that we have a greater appreciation for organization as a phenomenon in society. But here are the 2 shifts in values that I think, or that I wish will come out of this. The first one relates to temporality. One of the clear indications or one of the clear temporal trends up to this time has been this notion of operating the market system on increasingly attenuated time scales. There is this hyper compression of time that we expect things to occur faster and faster and faster. And I'll give you an example of that. When we look at the corporate form is an organizational structure that was created to outlast the lives of the individuals who founded them. The bitter reality, though, is, and McKinsey did a recent study on this, is that the lifespan of the corporation rarely lasts longer than the individual. Average corporation back in the 1960s lasted about 30 years. That's much shorter than the average lifespan of an individual. And more recently, if you update that into the 2000s, the average lifespan of the corporation is in its teen years. And the corporational form itself is starting to disappear. So my hope is, and in the context of the more humanistic values that Elaine described, my hope is that we start taking much longer term perspectives of all sorts of things, but particularly longer term perspectives in organizations, that we try and build organizations that are designed to last as they were originally designed to do, last longer than the individuals who founded them. The second shift that I think will happen as a result of the post-pandemic world, and I think I see it a little bit occurring now, is a shift away from legitimacy as the standard of corporate performance to a shift toward authenticity as the social value judgment that we assess corporations by. Legitimacy means, or is a justification used for corporations acting like every other corporation. If you ask a corporation why they do it, they say, well, the business roundtable says that this is what we're going to do, and so this is what we do. And that sort of justification has been used to legitimate a whole bunch of egregious behaviors by the corporate world. What I see now is a different social value judgment standard emerging out there. And this is a standard of authenticity. And that is, do the words do the words that you use to describe what you're doing and why you're doing it match or comply with the behaviors that we see what you're doing. And I expect that in the process of commensuration, there will be an entire business consulting industry building up around this, which is designed to make sure that there is a degree of compliance between the words we use to say what we're doing and the actual behaviors. The danger in all of this, of course, is that authenticity is, we tend to assume that the word authenticity means that the original idealistic purpose will be followed. But of course, authenticity isn't always, I mean, the common phrase often attributed to Philip Selznick is that authenticity is best when you can fake it really well. So we should not underestimate the ability of the corporate world to fake authenticity. But those are the two value shifts that I hope we see: longer time horizons in what we do, and a shift toward authenticity and away from legitimacy.
Thank you very much, Elaine and Roy. Now let's move on to Henry.
I don't see battle lines forming here. It seems to be more a leaven than the basis for disagreements. I think it was George, other than the fact that I think it was George Burns who said authenticity is everything. If you can fake that, you can fake anything. I think it came from George Burns, but anyway, it doesn't matter. And I appreciate the emphasis on organizations. I'm yet another macro organization theorist because I've just finished a book called Understanding Organizations, finally. So thank you for that inadvertent plug. Post-pandemic, I don't think it matters. I don't think there's anything post or pre-pandemic about this. I think the problems have been pre-pandemic. They've been getting steadily worse. There's some blips in certain behaviors during pandemic and shortly after the pandemic, but whether this is a new world, I don't see much evidence of that. I see evidence of things getting steadily worse. Let me just go back to the Business Roundtable. I happen to track the Business Roundtable statements about shareholder and stakeholder value over 4 statements. And the one in the 80s was all in favor. I don't think they used the word stakeholder, but they were all in favor of it. And then what's his name came along, Jack Welch, in I think it was 1989, and he championed a statement that said businesses have no business attending to anybody but shareholders. How else would they make decisions? I kind of like, it's as if Jack Welch was saying chief executives have lost their capacity for judgment. So don't force them to make judgments between different stakeholders. The world's much easier if you make judgments, if you make decisions purely about shareholders. I think it was 89. 2012, exactly the same statement as 2019. Go look. Jesus, that's just disheartening. They said it in 2012. And what happened between 2012 and 2019? It got steadily worse. So why should we believe that in 2019 that statement is going to change anything? And that brings me to prediction. If we're in the business of prediction, it was some clever Dane, or apparently a whole bunch of them, who said they never predict, especially the future. And my view is that optimists predict what they like and pessimists predict what they don't like. I would like to go back because I can't predict the future, but I can sure as hell infer patterns in the past. And the pattern I infer is that the problem gets steadily worse. I don't care what the Business Roundtable claims. I don't care about all the other greenwashing that goes on. And this is, I'm a one-horse pony or whatever that expression is. I've got one issue these days, and it's imbalance in society. Our societies are terribly out of balance. Our Western so-called democratic societies, especially the so-called liberal democracies, are terribly out of balance. Just the way the communist countries were out of balance, only on the other side, they were out of balance on the side of public sector power, and we're out of balance on the side of private sector power. And that's why I find it amusing, and I'm sure this is bound to come up. You know, nobody said it yet, and the three of us probably not inclined to say it necessarily, but everybody's running around, especially in the United States, talking about fixing capitalism. I just found out to my horror that even Hazel Henderson, who I always thought very highly of, is also part of the Harvard Business School now, and is also part of this thing that if only we can fix capitalism, everything will be fine. No, fixing capitalism will not fix the problem. We need to fix society. Yes, we need to fix capitalism, but that will not fix the imbalance. The imbalance is that capitalism and not free, but private enterprise has much too much power. And it's evident in absolutely everything. If you put that together, it's quite clear that there's an enormous imbalance in the Western countries in favor of private sector power. It's only the Scandinavian countries and a few here and there that manage some kind of balance. Germany's not bad, Canada's not bad, New Zealand's good, but for the most part, business dominates, and globalization is economic globalization. So, and this is what I go around saying these days: we will make no headway on climate change, zero, until we rebalance our societies. And this idea that business is going to do the rebalancing is laughable, because business has the power. Are they going to rebalance by giving away power, saying, oh my God, we finally realized we have too much power and we're going to give it away, or give a portion of it away so the world will be a better place? Don't hold your breath, please. Anyway, okay, it's enough for now. I'm sure we'll get back to it.
Thank you, Henry, for your points. So now we will allow for 5 questions from the audience. We will start with those who are present here, and then Michael will coordinate those who are online, writing questions on the chat. So, Henry, you are managing the microphone. If there is any question in the room. Okay, here we have 2 questions.
Thank you.
Please, could you say your name and
yes, Robert Gregory, University of Miami. So my question is, what are the risks of this imbalance? So if we look at recent cases like the Boeing case, where clearly the corporate logic dominated the logic of professional science logic, of professional engineering, and you saw this disaster of the airplane crashes and a lot of fatalities. And we have many other examples where the corporate logic is dominating other aspects that an organization needs to attend to. So what are the risks of this imbalance for the society? That's my question.
Okay. Henry, Elaine, or Roy, whoever would like to answer.
Want me to say something? If you, it's okay. If you give a little boy the rule of the tool, if you give a little boy a hammer, everything looks like a nail. My hammer is rebalancing society, and I see nails everywhere. Just open the newspaper any day, anytime, watch the news, executive compensation that gets steadily worse. I mean, Fortune magazine has been spoofing executive compensation for decades. They once had a pig on the cover of Fortune magazine about an article about executive compensation. I mean, that's just one of many things. The trade tribunals that destroy democracy by enabling corporations to sue governments for legislation that gets in the way of their profits. SLAPs, strategic, whatever they're called, lawsuits to shut people up by suing people who say things that corporations don't like. Not all corporations are bad, plenty of corporations are good, but the number that are bad these days and growing, look at Uber, who just did anything they damn well pleased. You know, finally we got a guy in Texas who's being forced to pay for nonsense that we've been putting up with on Fox News and everywhere else for years. It's everywhere.
You are not right to ask what you
I think that was pretty impressive, Liz. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's move on to the second question here in the room. Thank you.
I am John Almandos from IESE Business School. And also on this question of balancing societies. So the institutional logic perspective does include the state and the corporation, but there is also other things like, family, community, religion, this and that as basic logics of society. So would the rebalancing act also require getting to some of those dormant institutions as well?
I don't want to, should I?
Yes, please.
I don't want to dominate, but I guess I raised the issue. We will not get balance from the powers that be, because they, after all, are the beneficiaries of imbalance. The Reformation in the 16th century did not start with the wealthy or the Pope. It started with an obscure monk, and it spread on the ground. I am increasingly convinced that we will get nowhere. Certainly, fixing capitalism is a band-aid to pacify people who want to make sure they don't lose anything. But it's not a question of, it's a question of losing greed. It's not a question of sending, Musk into poverty. It's a question, for example, of taxing people properly. But it's going to happen on the ground. Just one quick thing. Franklin Delano Roosevelt told an activist who wanted his support, he said, I agree with you, I want to do it, go out and make me do it. It's the population that makes people do it.
I'm going to respond as well to that, and one of the concerns that I have in the assumption of the question is that somehow the corporations are the only source of evil and problematic business practices here, and that somehow those will be corrected by different organizational or institutional forms, like the family, for example. Well, the corporation as an economic structure is actually in massive decline right now. One of the fastest growing components of economic structures in other parts of the world outside the UK and North America are family-controlled businesses. Family-controlled businesses are closely held corporations, or often trusts that are not open to the public scrutiny that the public corporation is. And even in the public corporation context, those monies are being driven into institutions, trusts, and private equity firms. So much as we hate the problems created by publicly traded corporations, they are somewhat more accessible to public control and public disdain than are these other organizational forms that are emerging.
Can I react to that just briefly? I don't want to dominate this thing, but if you go to Denmark, you find that most of the major corporations are publicly traded, but their voting shares are held in trusts. So they're both. They're on the stock market, but the stock market doesn't control their behavior. Denmark and the Scandinavian countries in general are among the most balanced in the world today. Tata is controlled by family trusts. So I think it's actually a viable alternative because corporations are controlled socially. They're not only controlled by the rules of the marketplace or the rules that governments impose on publicly traded corporations about reporting and all that. Corporations are controlled socially by the society in which they function. And I think that works a lot better in Denmark, for example, than it works in the US.
And one quick response to Henry's comment is, as a former lawyer, yes, there are some balanced structures out there, but there are also very, very mysterious trusts that are used to organize some of the most evil organizations out there, like the International Olympic Committee, and which are organized as vereins in Switzerland, which means we have absolutely no access to their public information, and it's almost impossible to sue them. And these trusts are also the primary source of organization of the large of the big four accounting firms as well. So yes, there are options out there, but there are also some dangers.
Sure.
Thank you very much. This is one of the aim of the symposium, to have this type of exchange also between the panelists. So Michael, if you have any questions from the online participants.
Yes, from Isabel Romanossi. She's asking also Henry and the rest, of course, in a way, like what can be done to address the imbalance? What's the power of the grassroots, particularly the youngest generation? I think some of you speculated already. Maybe you can continue a bit.
Let me say a word. I keep apologizing, but anyway. I use the Reformation as an example. I use the Quebec Quiet Revolution as an example. The Quebec Quiet Revolution was driven largely by women who were tired of the Catholic Church telling them to have 10 babies. And it was just a social uprising. It was a social movement that changed Quebec dramatically in the space of no time. People, the mothers of people my age had 8, 10, 12 children. Almost all the women of my age I know have 2, 3 children, or 1, 2 children. These things happen. They happen when people get sufficiently fed up. And the important thing is, the private sector has the power of consolidation. When business wants something, even competitive businesses know how to get their act together, whether it's a Davos or chambers of commerce or whatever. They know how to act together. The plural, what I call the plural sector, which is community sector, not organizations that are either cooperative or non-owned, which is huge but obscure. It's what the French call pagaille, it's chaos. The World Social Forum was held in Montreal and went a few years ago, was great fun, but absolutely everywhere. The plural sector, the community sector, has trouble getting its collective act together, and until it does, but you see, one last quick thing. When I speak to people from Greenpeace or Amnesty International, I say, you know what? You're not going to get very far with your concerns about environment or justice until the world is rebalanced. So your real purpose is to collaborate, work together to change the imbalance. Then we'll get justice. Then we'll get action on climate change. Then we'll get action on income disparities, not before.
Yeah, I think there are some positive signs out there about social movements that are looking for elements of justice and social change. For example, the Roads Must Fall movement, which is a movement against colonialism. One of the interesting questions for me is why has it taken so long for people to react to this? So yes, social movements do have the opportunity to create glimmers of hope. However, there is a wonderful paper published in AMJ quite recently about the way in which corporations actually exploit social movements, collaborate with Greenpeace, for example, to tackle or try and denigrate their competitors. So again, we should never underestimate the capacity of the corporations to subvert the intent of social movements.
Thank you very much. Michael, do you have any other questions? So
we have another question. Yeah, we have a question from Ruben Burga on the subject of authenticity. And he's writing that it's emotive and sounds intuitively good, but how is it promoted at the corporate level when there are power imbalances among stakeholders? To Elaine or Roy.
Okay, I think I should start with that one, but I'd encourage the other panelists to chip in. Yeah, authenticity. So C. Wright Mills wrote about, he had a wonderful paper back in the day called Vocabularies of Motive, and authenticity, as I indicated, is really subject to subversion as well. And authenticity is a vocabulary of motive that sells and can be used to mask ill intent. Absolutely no question. And so one of the dangers that exist out there is that authenticity is used as a weapon for corporations to attack their competitors. Any claim of morality can be used to disguise an effort to increase your profits. It's probably best understood in the context of macro international politics. Why is it that the United States wants to impose emission control standards on China and India? The response from China and India is that your purpose isn't entirely moral or a claim to authenticity. Rather, it's you've had the opportunity to pollute the world for 100 years, and now you want to deprive us of that opportunity. So authenticity is a vocabulary of motive that can be very easily weaponized.
Thank you, Roy. Elaine, do you have to react, or Henry, any reaction?
No,
to
I
that?
agree completely.
Okay, thank you. So we allow the last question here in the room, and then we move on to the second question, and then we will have some time at the end for the remaining questions. So, thank you.
Hi, good morning. I have a question for Elaine. Thank you for this idea of working on values. And I just, curious to learn if we have already done something on this in business schools. Are we teaching these values? How are we teaching these values? I mean, how do we implement as business schools all these ideas that you share with us? Henry talked about collaboration, right? How we teach our students to collaborate. That's my question. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, and I think our third question here is going to talk about what a post-pandemic business school looks like. But yeah, I think you can do a number of things. I know at the school I'm at, one of the things that we did is we created this kind of innovative course called Leadership for Social Impact, where it puts people, puts students in contact with organizations where they try to solve social problems. So it's tapping values, community values. They go out in the community, and the assumption is in this field project, they will have some understanding and appreciation for social values as a result of having, worked in the community. We've got a leadership institute that's underway, and the idea is to get rising leaders and try to get people who are starting their leadership journey. And so trying to inculcate values that are, creativity, inclusivity, being vision driven. And those are efforts that I think we're making. I think that schools are trying to do this. I mean, if you look at curricula and how they've changed over the years, I think there's been an effort to try to, integrate ethics, for example, across the curriculum. And so some of this idea of getting these values, in organizations and business schools depends on some kind of I think, recognition that it has to be at the level of the curriculum. It also I think involves a mind shift where you're focusing on how people think about values, not necessarily on the skills that we teach them in business schools, but more on the mental values that they come with, which is, I think, difficult as we become more specialized in business schools and have, all these special degrees rather than a more comprehensive, holistic degree. So I appreciate your concern, and I think it's one step at a time. I mean, it's one incremental step at a time. And I think we share best practices and we recognize those instead of recognizing things like numbers of publications in academic. We recognize impact in academic. So I don't know if that helps, but yeah.
Thank you, Elaine. Roy, Henry, would you like to add something to this? The question was to Elaine. But...
Yeah, I'll just say a couple of things. The last way in which we can teach students to collaborate is by sitting them in a classroom in nice, neat rows and listening to a professor. That hardly encourages collaboration. Nor, even worse, is when they sit in those rows and fight with each other over cases to be clever and impress the professor. That hardly encourages collaboration. I can get into it later, but in our program, we take people who are managers mid-career in our master's program, who are managers mid-career. They sit at round tables and they spend a lot of time learning from each other and sharing their experiences and reflecting on them together. That at least sits them in a way that facilitates collaboration. And Elaine, let me say something sort of sacrilegious, but why not? As you're saying it, and it's not about you or at all what you're doing, it's about what I'm hearing every day, all the time. It occurred to me, the way to put it is leadership is a fundamentally narcissistic concept. That when you say leader, you mean an individual. We never say leader and mean a group. When we say leader, we mean an individual. That encourages narcissism. And there's this kind of almost disease about leader, everything's leader. And the more of that we do, the less of it we get. So my word is communityship. I prefer communityship to leadership, which is a fundamentally collaborative concept. So every time someone uses the word leader from now on, just change it to community, leadership to communityship, and you'll be doing a lot of changing. Our healthcare program has the word in it too, unfortunately, because we were told that healthcare people don't want to hear the word management, they want to hear the word leadership. So, but anyway.
Yeah, I'll just add a quick note that reinforces, I think, both what Elaine and Henry have said. And as an organizational theorist, I've always been troubled by the fact that business schools have largely become cheerleaders for large multinational corporations and for the stock market, and having people sit in rows and wait for their turn is part of working for a large bureaucracy. I think that we can correct that value assumption by understanding that those jobs, those roles, those corporations comprise only a small part of the organizational world. And we could refocus ourselves by training folks for jobs in other positions, in government, in not-for-profit organizations, in arts organizations, in healthcare and community organizations. And when we start thinking of the business school world as appealing to this larger array of organizational structures, I think we start solving some of those problems.
Well, thank you very much, Elaine, Roy, and Henry, for answering the first question, and of all of you with your questions as well. Let's move on to the second question is, what is the purpose of business in a post-pandemic world? Is there any shift, or is similar to the previous one? Thank you. So Elaine, you would like to start, and then Henry would like to be the last one.
Is that what we'll do? Okay. Okay, so the purpose of business organizations in a post-pandemic scenario, in some ways, I think that we all know the purpose of business organizations is to provide some sort of value to society through providing a good or service. But I think what we need, and this is aspirational as well, is to have businesses take more responsibility for the harm that they do in that process. And so I think there's a dual purpose, providing the good and service to society, but also being accountable for the business practices that are destructive in the process of doing it. I've already mentioned valuing people. I think, creating meaningful and purposeful work should be a purpose of business organizations. And that's again from my more humanitarian perspective and concern with individuals and organizations. I really think there needs to be a move away from the trade-off mentality. And so the dean of my organization is Marianne Lewis, and she does a lot of work on paradox. And I really think it applies to this situation in that we've gotten ourselves in a situation when we look at the purpose of business and we see it as either or. We are either going to make a profit or we're going to be purpose-driven. We're either going to focus on shareholder wealth or we're going to care about people. And you get into these conundrums when you have the either or thinking. I think looking for the both ands rather than the either ors should be a purpose of business. I think there's an increasing movement in that regard. I was heartened by I looked this morning at the papers that received awards here at the Academy in the Organizational Behavior Division. And a lot of them are kind of barking up this tree. So I think in some ways, at least we are starting in academics to recognize the importance of these questions. I think we also need to measure things differently, measure the performance of an organization, not necessarily by profitability, but by legacy, by responsibility, by the altruism, by the good that they do. And I know that sounds kind of Pollyannic, but I think that's a way that, what gets rewarded gets repeated. And so those are some things that I think I would identify as purposes.
So my answer, actually, Henry stole the thunder for my answer to this question, which was I actually did my homework too and looked at the shifting definitions of purpose of the corporation by the Business Roundtable. And as Henry points out, it's much as Eric Abramson would describe as a fad and fashion in business. First, it's shareholder value, then it's stakeholder value, then it's shareholder value, then it's stakeholder value again. There is this cyclic response to some sort of pressure that's going out there. And again, I think these are not real statements. They're vocabularies of motive, and it's no accident that immediately after the 2019 statement by the Business Roundtable of stakeholder value, each of the significant leaders of the Business Roundtable, including the president of General Motors and the CEO of Amazon, got immediately identified as violating the very statement that they signed within months of issuing those statements. So the question for me coming out of this is the business of the purpose of businesses or the purpose of corporations is clearly under pressure to change in some way. And maybe we're in a bit of a conundrum by focusing too much or relying on the corporations themselves to be the source of this change. And I think we need to ask the broader question is, what do we have to do to change the nature of competition to shift the purpose of business organizations? And I'm old enough to remember way back, we always beat up on the economists, but I am old enough to remember when economists talked about Pareto competition or Pareto efficiency, where the idea of a marketplace was to have equal and open competition that would drive down the marginal value of products to a situation where everyone benefits, or we maximize the degree of benefits. And what is business schools done? Well, we've described all of the ways in which we can impede Pareto efficiency, barriers to entry, have power over your consumers, power over your suppliers. So I don't know that I know the answer to the question, but I think part of the answer is how we can deal with a redefinition of what competition is.
Thank you, Elaine and Roy. Henry?
So, yeah, I'll be brief for a change. I'm just going to repeat the obvious, but the purpose of business is to supply us with necessary, you might want to use a broader word, but necessary goods and services. That's the purpose of business. And other than that, the purpose of business is to mind its own business, is to stay in its place, which is the marketplace. And you've got businesses completely outside the marketplace, and the lobbying that takes place, particularly in Washington, but in lots of other places too, whether it's guns or pharmaceuticals, or everybody knows what's going on. It's been a complete corruption of government by businesses out of the marketplace. An executive comes to me, which none has ever done, and presumably never will, especially now, and says, what can I do to be socially responsible? My answer is get out of my government, stay out of my government. Let the elected politicians and the political process deal with that. This idea that business gets a place at the table of public policy, so it's a shootout between weak unions and strong companies or whatever it is exactly part of the problem. Business has no place, no particular interest, has no place at the policy table. They can feed into it, they can make suggestions, they have no right to, and it's utterly out of control right now.
Thank you very much. Now we will open to questions from the audience. So we will start with those who are present here, and then we move on to those in the chat. Yes, please.
Hi, thanks for the session. Keto from Wilfrid Laurier, Canada, University, Canada. So I hope you're thinking like as a researchers, teachers, as a AOM member, what we can do. I kind of recall a sort of article wrote by Dr. Roy Suddaby, talking about the future of the scholarship. You kind of have a bet on CMS, I got my PhD from York, I know you got your PhD from York. There is no CMS in doctor trainings. Right now, like my question, I guess, is what are your current thoughts? Do you still believe in CMS in the future? And right now, like as I understand, CMS is still kind of has very limited space. And also, Dr. Mintzberg talked about the power, talking about regulation of business. It's kind of a CMS stuff, more or less. So can you talk a little bit on this front? Thank you.
Well, I think that Henry hit the nail on the head in that we have this tendency not to or to avoid discussions about power in society, power in business, power in organizations. I'm not particularly sure why that is the case, but it ought to be an important subject. The big element of all of this for me as an institutional scholar is that we have started to lose our reflexivity about power in society and power in organizations. And institutional theorists would say that the power of the corporate sector in society has achieved a level of cognitive legitimacy. That is, it is so legitimate that we take it for granted that it becomes invisible. We've lost our ability to be critically reflexive. All of the comments that Henry has provided here are critically reflexive comments that suggest we need to pay attention to the corporation, to corporate power, and we need to deal with it. Again, I'm old enough to remember that back in the 1960s, there was a conversation about the military government corporate triangle where power was consolidated. Early 1970s, we had several theories in organizational theory that talked openly about power relations and power dependencies. We tend not to do that now, partly because business schools have become cheerleaders for corporations. One of the studies that we ought to do is how systematically over the last 20 years, labor relations has been drained out of the business school curriculum.
Thank you. Henry, Elaine, any reaction to Roy's point? Okay, let's move on to the second question in the room. Is there any second question? Okay, Michael, do you have any question in the chat?
Sorry, I was on mute. I can respond briefly. I was on mute. I tried to speak. Nobody was listening. The one thing the Academy of Management could do is run sessions like this. So I congratulate this having been done. The second thing is to recognize that it's the Academy of Management and not the Academy of Business. And there are plural sector organizations like co-ops and NGOs and everything else that deserve much more attention. Third of all, the classroom. I almost everything I've been talking about is on a website called rebalansingsociety.org, which kind of covers everything I've talked about with lots of backup and lots of detail, but also can go through it quite quickly. That can be used. A woman in England was worried that her children were not, she was a housewife, she was worried that her children were not getting enough on climate change in the classroom. So she went to see the teachers, went to see them, and they said, we don't have materials. So she developed materials to teach climate change in the classroom. That material is now being used in 300,000 schools. Okay, now, can we do material on rebalancing society? Yeah, in fact, I was approached by the AACSB, who were kind of interested in maybe working the idea of rebalancing society into their ethics side. I say it because I haven't heard for a while, so maybe it got scuttled or forgotten, or maybe they're busy. I don't know, but if anybody's listening, that's certainly something that could be done. The same woman who got this material into these schools, and she's not a management person at all, but she has an organization now that does this. She's decided that rebalancing society is the next step. So believe it or not, she had a group of 14-year-olds in a British school read my book, Rebalancing Society, and do a webcast in which they were asking me questions about my book. They were 14 years old and they were interested in the subject. So there's lots of possibilities for doing that.
Thank you very much, Henry. So, Michael, any questions in the chat?
Yeah, we do have a couple that are already going towards the business school specifically. If I wanted to just stay with the business and the role of business,
Yes.
there's one specific by Jyoti Bachani on the aesthetics and the role of aesthetics in the notion of business. Any responses there?
I like aesthetics, and I like companies that do things that look good. I think I admire Steve Jobs as much for his aesthetics as for everything else. He just produced beautiful products that are nice to look at, including the one I'm looking at now. Yeah, I'm all in favor of that.
And I would just add briefly that we can learn a lot about morality from aesthetics. We never ask ourselves, we tend to ask ourselves, what is an effective organization? We don't ask ourselves, what is a good organization? The theory of aesthetics can teach us to ask that question.
Thank you, Elaine. Any reaction to that? It's okay. Let's move on to the second question. You have Michael there, and then we have an additional question in the room.
Well, the second question right now is more about existential intelligence, a concept I hear developed by Howard Gardner, and in and throughout the crisis. Is there anything that you want to speak to in terms of how corporations can take that on? Tracy Chang is asking in the context of the problematic of authenticity, value, morality, and purpose. They're all socially constructed. So Al-Qaeda can be all of those things. What distinguishes a business in that context, and how can a business not be suicidal, but yeah, have the existential intelligence?
Nobody wants that.
There is no.
I can say
I
something.
hesitate to take that one
Henry
on.
go. Yeah. Sorry, Henry, do you have a response to that one?
No, I'm not sure how I would deal with it.
I'll use the schoolboy trick of reformulating the question. I don't know what existential intelligence is. I'd like to learn more about it, but I do think that we need to ask some questions about what role business and management can do to deal with sort of ontological givens that we have out there. These are issues that all humanity faces, and I do believe that we all die. We are all born of woman. These are ontological givens that all humanity shares. And I do think that the United Nations SDGs come very close to asking ontological questions like that. So if existential intelligence has something to do with those ontological issues that we all face as humanity, I'm all for it.
Yes, and I just Googled it. That's, I think, what Tracy you're referring to, right? How, I think Howard Gardner was saying, how is a person or an organization actually prepared to deal with these existential questions of purpose, of meaning, et cetera, all of those that we mentioned before.
I think we do privilege certain sorts of knowledge and intelligence in organization, in business schools. And so maybe, you know, this person, I think it's a good point by the caller. Maybe we need to be more thinking about philosophical traditions when we're teaching people, you know, not just focus on these very narrow skill sets that we try to build in business schools, but we try to open the aperture a little bit and to consider ways of knowing. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Thank you very much. The last question here in the, sorry,
Yeah,
Henry, would you like to add something?
I'm just not sure I've been doing anything different today, but who knows?
Thank you very much. So the last question, you have the question. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Patrick Mathieu. I'm from Paris, France. And my question was about what Mr. Mintzberg said about there's no place at the policy table for our companies. My question is this not US-centric?
Absolutely. Absolutely, but not uniquely. And besides, everything America does, everybody else does eventually anyway.
Again, thank you very much for your answers and your participation. Let's move on to the third question. The dynamics is working very well. We are on time. So Michael, do you like to deal with the last question?
Yes, sure. So I think this is what we're all here for. Like, what can we do in the context of this, in assuming that many of us are teaching in business school? And what can be done in this context? Post-pandemic, pre-pandemic, just in general, in what way are we living up to the legitimacy question, the morality question, the purpose question? And so just getting back closer to home.
Okay, so I want to start my part here with a quote, and this was actually in the New York Times. It was a guest essay a couple months ago by a gal named Molly Wharton, and she's an historian at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And she says, you know, here is the central tension of modern business education. At a time when society needs managers who can grapple with uncertainty and operate in a culture divided over basic questions of justice and human flourishing, most business schools still emphasize specialized skills and quantitative methods, the seductive simplicity of economic and social scientific models. I thought that was a really good way of expressing the concerns that we're talking about today around, you know, values and inculcating those in terms of organizations with purpose. And so I think I would start with the three-legged stool. You know, all of us who are academics know the three-legged stool: research, teaching, and service. And that's what drives our reward system. It drives our promotion system. And look at them in different ways. Are there different kinds of research that we could be doing? And I know when I was working with Jerry at AMJ on the Grand Challenges special issue, it was amazing how many papers came in with topics that are very interesting and very applicable societally. So I think tackling more of the Grand Challenge issues that we did in that special issue, it was a 2016 special issue of AMJ, if you want to and haven't seen it, and focusing more on the wicked problems that we've been talking about this morning, rather than the easy, simple, let's incrementally add another moderator problems. And I think some of that involves maybe doing some kinds of action research where you actually put yourself in a position of being in an organization and trying to problem solve hand in hand with a manager. I know people who have done action research. A lot of times that's confined to schools of education, at least in my institution. I think we can recognize and reward that kind of research more often, because I think it does help solve problems. In terms of teaching, we've made an effort at my institution to try to use problem solving as what's driving our curriculum. And so, you know, no matter what the context, trying to teach people to solve problems and be more societally aware and engaged. And then in terms of service, you know, we always, when we do our CVs, we always have, you know, service to department, service to the college, service to the university, service to the profession. We don't always have service to the community. And we're actually embedding that a little bit more. And I think Europe does this better than the US, embedding that a little bit more in our workload model. that it's important to connect with and advance and advocate community initiatives in addition to the things that we're doing. Things like homelessness, things like inequality, things that we may be able to provide some insight about and some service, and working with local governments more. And so that's kind of a sea change from the traditional three-legged stool and the traditional things that get rewarded. We focus on building skills, but I think we try to shift mindsets, and we focus, try to teach we teach competence, but we don't always teach character. And so I don't know if you can teach character, but I think you can teach people interpersonal skills in various settings to help with that. I think we need to broaden our interpretation of what impact means beyond numbers of publications, beyond numbers of students served. What is the impact of a business school? And I think that definition needs to be broadened. I think in the rankings, and many schools are tied to rankings, they want to be listed as a top business school. But having those rankings recognize more readily this broader impact. You know, there's real power in social comparison. So if there's a ranking that recognizes good that's being done by business schools, you know, I think that would go a long way. And then finally, this New York Times guest essay that I mentioned by Molly Wharton also said that curriculum in business schools is too focused on sharpening tools to ask what those tools are for. And I thought that was a really good quote about how we kind of continue to refine something, and maybe we need to look at what it is we're refining. So that's my 2 cents.
Great. Well, my answer is going to reflect, or is going to focus largely on the sort of knowledge that we produce in business schools. And it will also reflect the excellent question by the gentleman interested in a more critical and reflective approach to the knowledge that we produce. So there has been an ongoing discussion about what sort of knowledge should come out of business schools, and a wonderful book published by Rajesh Khurana at Harvard about the loss of professionalism in business schools. And I agree entirely with that. What's missing in that book, though, is what sort of professional knowledge we are producing. And the challenge is that we look to different other professions, different traditional professions, to model our professional knowledge on. And so Rajesh's argument is that we have focused too much on scientific knowledge, and maybe we need to focus a little bit more on normative and moral knowledge. And that's an interesting suggestion, but I think it's a little bit dangerous, actually. There actually, if you read Abbott very, very carefully, and other sociologists of the profession, they will identify 3 basic categories of professional knowledge. The knowledge that's produced in medicine is very technical, objective, and based on the logic of scientific knowledge, no question. The model that Rajesh is using is the normative model of knowledge produced by legal theorists, by law. And that tends to be attentive to shifting demands in culture and society around us. But they will point out that some professions, the military, they would say, and they would also say business, are syncretic professions that need to look to both of those and synthesize those models of knowledge. We can't abandon the objective scientific knowledge that we have, but we need to integrate into that a notion of moral or normative responsibility. That is, unlike scientists who want to see the world the way it is, and unlike the normative people who want to see the world only the way that it could be or should be, we need to integrate those, and we've abandoned that mission to integrate. So how do we do that? Well, we need to be open to this idea of syncretic knowledge and expand the boundaries of what we seem to think business schools are about. We are not just cheerleaders for multinational corporations. We should encourage the innovation of different organizational forms that can solve some of these problems. And we should be, and I'll close with this, we should be attentive to other forms of knowledge that come from marginalized members of our society. So in Canada, we have done egregious things to our Indigenous populations. At the University of Victoria, we have become very, very attentive to hiring Indigenous PhDs and trying to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into our management curriculum. indigenous knowledge tends to get subverted, that we think that what we should do is indigenous entrepreneurship. We should teach the indigenous population how to be entrepreneurs. But our indigenous scholars say, you know, giving the indigenous population a marketing textbook is exactly the same kind of colonization that we used to use by giving them Bibles. Maybe we should bring them into the curriculum and allow them to give us some information about how they organized. We may not know this, but when Thomas Jefferson was writing the US Constitution, he consulted with the Iroquois Confederacy because they had a more democratic form of formulating their society. So my point is, we need to embrace our syncretic knowledge base as a profession, and we need to act on that by incorporating different types of knowledge.
So I think for starters, MBA programs are deeply dysfunctional. I think they train too many aggressive narcissists who end up being dangerous in the executive suite. And I'm not saying that for shock effect. I do believe that. We're all about evidence and we're all about research. The only research I know about the performance of chief executives in corporations with MBAs is highly negative and totally ignored. We did an initial study where Harvard, in a book in 1990, identified, it was a book about Harvard, but at the beginning of the book, they had a table of their superstars as of 1990, 19 chief executives. So we tracked the performance of those 19 chief executives over about 12 or 13 years. 10 of them were total failures. I mean, they were fired, the company went bankrupt. I mean, total failures. 4 of them were questionable and 5 of them looked to be okay. Subsequently, Danny Miller did some other studies. They're in my blog. You can search some MBAs as CEOs in my Mintzberg.org blog. What he found in a couple of studies was that MBA, not Harvard MBAs, but general MBAs as chief executives do worse and get paid more. You ever heard of it? I mean, these are published studies. Why are business schools not, you know, the implication is business schools themselves are deeply sick. They've got enormous influence. They're charging up to $200,000 or maybe more to get an MBA. So my daughter's doing a PhD in social work, and we got together because we have very similar views, not because she's my daughter, on the future of the university. And we've given a number of talks. And we're preparing a paper that compares a looking on model with a reaching out model. And this is not an either or. We come to the conclusion it should be both. But the looking on model is where we're detached and we kind of look out at society. We get our data remote control. We don't get on the ground, see what's going on. We teach, you know, mostly us to them, and so on and so forth. And a couple of interesting examples of this in my own school. We're insistent on trying to measure who should get bonuses, which faculty should get how much bonuses. And there is actually a proposal that says that A journals will count for 3 points. A single A journal article will count for 3 points and a book will count for 1 point. Got that? This is we haven't passed it yet, thank goodness, but this is actually a proposal by a committee of the faculty. This is not some nutty professor. So we're loaded with this stuff of complete detachment from the world we're supposed to be serving. So we need to reach out. We need to look on, sure, but we also need to be objective, but we also need to reach out. We don't need, this is not about the business school post-pandemic or pre-pandemic. The problems were there pre-pandemic, they continue post-pandemic. And as I mentioned earlier, I won't get into detail, but our IMPM program, our International Masters program for managers, sits them at round tables, enables them to learn from their own experience. They spend half the class time at the tables, reflecting with each other on their own experience. The other half, we dump in our brilliant theories and all that stuff. But we're trying to do that synthesis. We're trying to create that synthesis in the classroom. Business schools have to wake up. But of course, why should you wake up if you're charging $200,000? And what are you doing in society if you're sending people out who have to pay $200,000 for that education? You know, they have to go and work on Wall Street to make a ton of money to exacerbate the problems. And you're catering to an incredible elite. This is what business schools are doing. They're on the wrong side of the equation, in my view.
Thank you very much. Let's go to the questions from the people here present. We have one question there, and then Michael. You have a reaction
I
too.
just wanted to say too, if you don't have a question, but you have something that you want to share that worked well, could we? Because, you know, I think I'm benefiting today from hearing things that are being done by where Henry is, things that are being done by Roy's. And so if there's something you want to share that you think would be good for the good of the cause, I would, yeah.
Thank you, Elaine, for that point. Yes.
Hi, everyone. It's David Jones from Newcastle Business School in the UK. I'd like to, I was inspired, Henry, by your example from my own country with regard to the parents who obviously changed curriculum within the school system. I'm well aware of it because my wife is a school teacher. So I'm aware of all the challenges in that particular sector. I'd like to put my question around academics who feel like that parent, who want to actually do something within a system which is about the rhetoric of impact, service, where our contribution and process is an auditable commodity, devised around an evidential trail of what we contribute towards. And if I may put it like this, how do we free actors ourselves within this room who are, and this is the way I would put it, are caged within their own business school and universities to develop more meaningful futures rather than meaningless futures? Are we trying to fix business schools and universities when we should fundamentally be challenging the institutional barriers and senior management within our and the institutional actors around it, around accreditations, you know, accreditors, etc., around this legitimizing culture that we live in, sort of the culture where we're answerable to bodies that maybe enslave us, really. So does the ontological responsibility lie with us? And do we need a fundamental look at university business school futures whose legitimizing institutions and management are frantically trying to keep a sense of control through greenwashing, etc.? So it's a long question, but I'm just interested in your views about alternative organizing forms which unleash a more generative plurality around these social movements, local communities, co-ops, NGOs. Put it in another way, are our universities and senior management dead in terms of responding to what is out there, like these parents, like children that Henry talked about, and ourselves? How can we unleash ourselves from that cage, that auditable commodity cage? What are the sort of new organizing forms that can actually give us that autonomy and that focus on actually creating and crafting change where we're not enslaved by what we all know as a sort of a complicity to an evidential auditable trail within our working life? Long question, I know, but I think who needed saying.
I'm just struck by the expression caged within a business school. That's a powerful expression. Sounds like a good critical theory kind of topic. Yeah, I try to think of things. I try to be, maybe I am the optimist person, but I try to, when I want something done in my institution, we've got a strategic plan called Next Lives Here, for example. If you can couch what you want done within the context or the language of the power party in the organization, I think they listen. They're more attentive, So Next Lives Here. So, I think we need some kind of initiative where we teach students how to do nonprofit leadership rather than just focusing on business. Then I can say, I'll make a case for why this contributes to the mission. I don't know that I can change that mission. It's a huge university. It's a huge organization, but I can make a little incremental difference in my area and don't feel so caged maybe. I mean, that's just my personal take.
I'll give a quick answer to a long question. If you want to reform an organization or an institution, you need to change the reward structure, the compensation structure. And business schools are moving, and Henry alluded to this, business schools are moving to what, when I was in the legal profession, is called an eat what you kill system. If you publish enough, you take home the lion's share of the money. Law firms that do high quality work are not eat what you kill firms. They are let's share the wealth firms, and we need to get back to that model.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's the same problem, whether we're talking about sort of fixing or bringing the business schools back to reality or being society overwhelmed by business back to reality. I think it's the same problem, not only because not only because they feed on each other, but because it's basically, how do you change behavior that is so entrenched? And you can't expect the people who do the behaving to change that. New generations come along and push out older generations. But look, it just occurred to me, I never thought about it this way until we had this question now. But who do business schools ask when they want to redesign their curriculum? How do they go to society? They go to their graduates. They go to the very people who were trained. Did any graduate in the history of Harvard ever say get rid of the case study method? The case study method is awful. It encourages people who know nothing about these companies to shoot their mouth off about where they should go. And then what happens when these people who have done hundreds and hundreds of cases at Harvard end up in the executive suite? Give me a case. There's evidence that something like 70% of all Harvard cases focus on largely on a single individual, the chief executive. Yeah, well, no kidding. They got in from a Harvard graduate who's sitting in that chair. And so that person gives them the word and may not even know what the cause of their success or failure really is. So when you step back and watch some of these things, you have to sort of, if you came from another planet, you'd have to say, what are these guys thinking? Like, this isn't huge, complicated problems. This is so patently obvious, and yet we can't get rid of it. Yeah, but as they say, if you're getting $200,000 per student, why get rid of it unless you're not totally sick in an economic sense? So yeah, getting out of the cage, getting out of the business school cage, getting out of the dominance of the private sector cage, getting out of the globalization, getting out of the global power, superpower cage. Any one of three people can destroy us all in a flash. While we're watching this, we could be gone because of one guy in Moscow, probably less likely one guy they're all guys in China, and one in the United States, who I have faith in will not do that, but I didn't have faith in his predecessor. And we just kind of blithely carry on. I made a case for what I call smaller powers, that the truly democratic countries need to get together and create an alternative to superpowers with nuclear weapons. It's everywhere, and we just kind of watch it, and we're okay so far. The guy jumped out of the Empire State Building, and as he passed the second floor, he said, "I'm okay so far." So we're okay so far.
Thank you, Elaine and Roy and Henry, for your answer. Any other question in the room? Okay, Michael, do you have any questions in the chat?
Yeah, we have a couple of comments and a couple of questions. If I were to summarize it very briefly, they're going about like how to rebalance. What's the countervailing power that we can tap into? And I think that's also part of another set of questions around mindset shift, paradigm shift, awareness, consciousness, and what we can do to educate for that. It probably is going beyond the implicit or intellectual, but going towards experiential learning of some sort that we may not yet have all the keys to. So I'm just throwing this out there as a bunch of thoughts of how people think what needs to happen. Maybe you can respond.
Can I pick up on that? I call it the Irene question. When I published my book, Rebalancing Society, it looks like that, in case you're interested. You got it? A woman named Irene, who was a finance manager in both the plural and the private sector, had been in both sectors, kind of read the book and said, I'd like to do something, what can I do? And I called it the Irene question because everybody who read the book said the same thing, what can I do? And every time I came up with a new answer, yes, everybody said, yeah, but what can I do? And it's always, what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? So on the rebalancengsociety.org site, there's a page called Acting, and it's got a table with, 6 times 18 dots, I think it is. And you hit a dot and it says, if you're in business and you want to correct what's wrong, here's a few things you can do. If you're in government and you want to reframe how you see the world, click here, here's what you can do. It's got about 30 or 40 different things. So I pulled all that together, and that there's enormous numbers of things that people could be doing, you know, but many people kind of ask that question, what can I do? Where do I get started? How do we do this? And you know, there's a book, what's his name? I always forget, I wrote it down because I always forget his name. Hawkins has a book about community. It's got 100 pages of appendices, and he talks about the fact that there are millions of social initiatives around the world. There are more social initiatives now than conceivably any time in history, of all, whether it's climate change, whatever it is, there's all kinds of social initiatives, but they don't have their collective act together. And I personally think they don't realize that underlying it all is the imbalance, and that's what's got to be addressed. So that's, anyway. Does that answer all the questions you have, Michael?
Yes. Problem solved. We can go home, have 10 beers.
Do you have another question? We have 3 minutes left, according to our timetable in the webpage, not in the room. It's 11 p.m. We end the session that time. Do you have another question in the chat, Michael, or anyone else?
No. I think that sort of summarized some of the comments. I mean, I'm sure I'm not doing them all justice, but I'd like to hear if Elaine or anyone else has some responses.
Okay, so I think I heard the overall question about how we can, can we educate for mindset shifts, which is a very different animal, you know. I think maybe we set expectations when people start in our MBA programs or whatever program we are trying to, you know, administer in our institutions, and we set expectations that there's going to be some reflection, some self-reflection, you know, I think we get so tracked and so narrow when we, you know, people start programs. I think building in some opportunity for reflection of some sort and discussion and think about how we're thinking. And I don't know, that's not a very concrete thing, but I think these rest pauses maybe are very useful in terms of changing mindsets versus, you know, the constant barrage of information that we try to push at people. Yeah.
Well, I think the question of how to rebalance really echoes the question that David asked about the cage that we're in. I mean, this is a classic institutional theory, statement attributed either to Max Weber or Clifford Geertz. We are captives of webs of meaning and norms that we've built for ourselves. So I think that we need to look to, if the question is how we rebalance business schools, I think that academics have to stop being so darn compliant to the bureaucrats that control them. We need to stand up for ourselves. We need to be more creative about what we do, and we need to expand our sources of knowledge, basically.
Henry, the last reflection.
It doesn't do me any harm to have taken those stands. I mean, we have tenure. We should be able to speak our minds on things we deeply feel. We're the privileged people in society. We're paid to play. We're paid to do what we like, hopefully responsibly. And so how can we not take proper positions? Of course, many of us do. And some of us think that our proper positions are improper. So, you know, so good, there's debate and discussion. But to be in a business school and be afraid to speak out is, especially if you're tenured, unfortunately, is important.
Well, thank you very much. We are just on time. It means that there will be a summary, but it's so impactful session. I think that the content is great. So rather than summarizing the content, we will post it as we did it in the last symposium last year. And Elaine did that great work, and we will do it together. So for you to have a reflection. And then I understand that this session was recorded just to see it again and to continue this reflective environment, because I think the key word here is to wake up and to be reflective, and then from changing our mindset and behavior, then the skill set. Thank you very much, Helene, Roy, and Henry, and Michael as well there. And thank you all of you for being here. So till next time, thank you.
Thank you.
We should do a debrief on this.